Here is Sailor Studio 235. This is a flat mid-tone of purple, and the writing sample has the same tone that we see in the swatch, which isn't always the case. It's fairly consistent tone shift as paper changes, and it does usually give some shading. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the performance is generally okay, but there can be a little bit of feathering. Nothing too distracting, but it isn't overly aggressive. I would call this fine for student note-taking, though for notes you may want a bolder purple. I think this would be a great second color on the page for a dark green or a darker purple. And for that, I would enjoy a bottle.
The pen for today is a Pilot Custom 823. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here is that nice flat mid-tone purple. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade very well, especially on this bright white Clairfontaine paper. There's not a single word you can look at that doesn't offer nice midtones and dark tones within it. Now, very often the darker tones come to the end, but look, prove it starts in the beginning, sides it happens in the middle, left it happens at the end. It is all over the place and doing an exceptional job, looking great on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Washington. Here is Sailor Kobe number 46 Museum Gray. Here is Sailor Studio 173. Here is Sailor Studio 670.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we see the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, but just a tad. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, and it doesn't shade nearly as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Though you can see some of the shading, like you see Answers is a much lighter tone in general than What above it, and Answers has a darker S at the end. Even within Answers, that middle S is slightly darker in tone. Where What above it, while mostly a darker tone, the A is a little bit lighter than the H and T that surround it. Looking at the back of the page, there's one or two spots, maybe three, where it got a little bit deeper into the paper. Now, it never bled through to touch the page underneath. Its ghosting isn't a problem, and I don't think these couple of spots would stop you from writing back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Now, we don't get feathering, we don't get spread, we get back up on the feathering, look at the end of subsets, tiny feathers, no big deal. We don't get spread, we do get shading, not as well as on the Clairfontaine, but definitely there. Not as frequent, like we can see Answer on the first line, all one tone, no tone change whatsoever. But Element on the third line starts lighter with the ELE, a slightly darker M, getting a little lighter into the EN, much darker T at the end. Now, I don't think this is being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning we have a more opaque ink here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather, does not spread, it does shade, though not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. It still is shading. It stands out okay against the quad rule. The quad rule doesn't completely melt into the background. You can still kind of see it. So if that's the way you prefer this to work out for you, then this could be a good ink. For me, this is not a good match on this paper because I don't want to see the quad rule after I've used it for aligning diagrams or writing. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with bleeding or ghosting, but I am going to say there are a few spots where I see it getting deeper into the page. Now, I said there's no bleeding problems. It's just a little bit of penetration deeper than we expect on a treated paper.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Diamine Lavender. Here is Monteverde Wisdom Purple. Here is Robert Oster Purple Soul, formerly Purple Jazz. Here is Schaefer Purple.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is noticeably lighter and flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does continue to shade, nowhere near as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at the and numbers, both on the second line. The, mostly really a very dark word, but numbers gets considerably lighter, except for that M in the middle that moves up from a lighter purple to a sort of mid-tone purple. It does stand out, I think, a little bit better here on the quad rule, but still not very well. I wouldn't count this against a student, though, if they were using it in their lab notebook. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Emerald. Here is Diatramentis Document Fog Gray. Here is Sailor Kobe number 54. Here is Van Diemen's Blonde Bombshell, a shimmering ink.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we see the tone is lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does feather fairly regularly. It does spread about as much as we would expect for copy paper. It does have some shading, but with shading comes even more feathers. Like you can see feathering here on throw where it's a nice mid-tone, but it's still got a fair amount of tiny feathers going on. Where the feathering gets heavier with the TS that's darker at the end. I don't think this is going to be a great ink for this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we have no real problem for ghosting. It never bled through to touch the page underneath, but it did very regularly get very deep into the page, a normal thing when dealing with copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow fine stub of my Pilot Custom 823 gives a very good mid-tone purple with decent shading. Off camera, I tried this in a wet medium, and the tone darkened very noticeably, and it's still shaded. So the pen depends on the purpose. As a primary writer, I go for a wet fine or wet medium to get a nice darker purple than we saw in the writing sample, but use the stub for fear of it lightening too much on the tone. Sorry, I don't use the stub for fear of it lightening the tone a little bit too much. But for a great second color on the page, I go for a medium to dry flow fine or medium nib, and that'll be easy enough to read, but not overpowering of whatever primary color you use, like a dark green.